My aim is to define the landscape, to find a way to conceptualize it in order to fully understand its quiddity. And I will borrow the original argument brought forward by Georges Duby in his book Dialogues. Listen to what he says. Men must feed themselves, wrest from nature the conditions for their survival, and can do so only by taking account of the environment that characterizes their habitat. History shows us, however, that their productive practices are not necessarily in functional accord with this environment, but are equally determined by rites, symbols, ideas, in brief, by a worldview. A pure productive practice does not exist. Every productive practice is immediately a symbolic practice of appropriation of the world. Every productive practice is a way of responding, fitted to a determined environment, to the basic biological requirement, but insofar as that is already culturally formulated, and the signature through which an environment testifies to this cultural requirement of survival is called landscape. So according to Duby, then, the landscape is a natural reality which has inscribed within itself a cultural code. This cultural code is, in the first place, an aesthetic code. I will mainly refer in my reasoning to corporate landscapes, meaning landscapes that characterize corporations and, in general, utilitarian organizations. The reason behind my interest for corporate landscapes lies in the fact that corporations are par excellence productive social systems, expressly governed by instrumental rationality. There, in corporate landscapes, the symbolic value of practices and the weave between expressive, disinterested aesthetic actions and impressive, interested actions aimed at practical results in contrast more clearly than in other non-utilitarian social aggregations. As Fine noticed, work is a minuet between expressive form and instrumental function. That in order to better understand this weave, I will propose some reflections on the relations existing between ideal concepts and images, forms, and style, systems of meanings and systems of sensations. To translate an idea into an image, or vice versa, entails passing from conceptual, abstract order to formal, concrete order, expressing, that is, representations of the mind in terms of relations between formal elements perceptible to the senses. In a visual image, these relations are spatial and chromatic. In an auditory perception, they are temporal relations between sonic stimuli of different pitch and intensity, and so on. Every cultural system seems to have structural correspondences between its ontological and deontological codes and its aesthetic codes. That is to say, between systems of beliefs and values on the one hand, and specific patterns of relation between formal elements on the other. Hauser, for example, studied the connection between the geometric style and the autocracy of forms of government in the cultures of Neolithic peasantry. Vernant studied the relationship between the structuring of space and the political organization in ancient Greece. And Panofsky studied the relationship between Gothic architecture and the scholastic philosophy. So students primarily interested in mental representations of culture often use the expression vision of reality, metaphorically, to indicate a conception of reality. I am suggesting that we use the expression literally to look at the corporate landscape as a materialization of a worldview and strive to interpret the aesthetic code written into the land. So how and when a land becomes a landscape? A land becomes a landscape when it is aestheticized, so to speak. This will happen in two different ways. Working that is in situ, in the physical space, and also in visu, into the eye. The first way consists of writing the aesthetic code directly onto the physicality of the place, populating the place with artifacts with given semiotic consequences. Every landscape has a scenographic element, meaning that it is constructed to be seen. This setting displays and hides, provides backgrounds and close-ups, sequences and articulations. Often, the setting constitutes a real visual metaphor. It prompts one to interpret a factory as a cathedral, a pathway as a labyrinth, and the ministry as a monastery. The second mode of aestheticization of a physical place, the writing of the aesthetic code into the eye of those looking at the scape, consists in educating the eye, in furnishing it with schemata of perception and use and taste, models of vision, lenses through which to look at reality. Of course, the aestheticization of the corporate stage is not achieved solely by creating and acting on the visible characteristics of a landscape. A landscape can be physically constructed to furnish sensory experiences which involve the other senses as well. It is also true that in the human species, not all the senses are equally developed or have the same completeness, the same perceptive potential as a sight. Nevertheless, the dynamics described with reference to vision are very likely common to all the forms of sense experience. Every organizational culture educates the sense of taste, of smell, of touch, of hearing, as well as of sight. It has also been rightly observed that the corporate stage is constituted not solely by inanimate material artifacts, but by human beings as well. Bodies are a vital, in the twofold sense of essential and alive, vital component of the landscape. They too, like material artifacts or inert nature, can be aestheticized, thereby giving material form to particular conceptions of an organization's identity and strategy. Think of the standardized body language and the dress code of an airline hostess or an employee of McDonald's. Thus, emphatically highlighted is the character of landscape as a technology of control, and the relationship between aesthetics and power, to the extent that the vision embedded in the landscape can be both a means with which individuals are able to define their personal identities and the means with which an organization can assimilate people and control them. An interesting question is to what extent the great social, economic, and technological changes that distinguish the present age foster the birth of organizations which are not only have organizational structures different from traditional bureaucracies, but are physical and spatial settings radically at odds with those to which we have been accustomed for so long. So let's have a look at the new emerging landscapes. The traditional organizational landscape, as outlined so far, is primarily a unitary physical space, partly natural and partly artificial, in which it is generally possible to regulate, facilitate, or impede flows of information and relationality, both within the organization and between the organization and the environment. But what landscape characterizes the organizations unconstrained by a territory, virtual communities, or temporary organizations which are going to be the organizational forms of the future? It's difficult to apply the idea of a landscape as something unitary which everyone, members or customers, are able to perceive, to deterritorialized organization, or at any rate to organizations whose members spend increasingly more time outside formal work areas. Actors perceive only the fragment of a landscape in which they are located or with which they are in contact. They can imagine or know through media transmitted images or sounds the work settings of the persons with which they must coordinate themselves, but they cannot perceive them sensorially and directly. In these cases, social interactions based on sensory contact, and therefore which may be regulated in their proxemic features by means of gestures and the reciprocal positioning of the actors in space, are significantly reduced. In the new physical workplaces, moreover, the fragment of a corporate landscape experienced by each actor may be confused with the domestic landscape and with other organizational ones. In situations like telecommuting, email at home, or daycare at work, the walls that separate work from the family and the other institutions to which the worker may belong, even temporarily, weaken or disappear here. And if the language of things and space is both a means with which individuals are able to define their personal identities and the means with which an organization can assimilate people and control them, the new work settings will probably prompt the invention and diffusion of new corporate artifacts and new semiotic conventions. Some authors have pointed out that both of these processes, identifying and assimilating, will presumably be based to an even greater extent on portable symbols. Company T-shirts or corporate ties can be expected to replace architecture, and business cards to replace diplomas and awards hanging on office walls or other office-bound symbols. In a certain sense, the only alternative to a virtual corporate landscape might be a miniaturized, or so to speak, a pocket-sized landscape. Some commentators maintain that in these circumstances, it will be more difficult for managers to use landscaping to condition the workers' experience, aesthetic experiences, and that there will be more space for individual freedom and empowerment. Others argue that it is impossible to determine on whether the new workspace aesthetic is representative of democracy or dictatorship, of employee empowerment or managerial control, or of all at one and at the same time. For sure, the traditional tried and tested systems of socialization, communication, and control will become largely obsolete, and the central role played in the new learning environments by computer-mediated communication is laying the basis for new kinds of aesthetic experiences, while rendering others unlikely. The computer screen separates the users from a real world of multiple perceptions, which engage all the senses and ushers them into a virtual world of infinite potential, made up of images, sounds, and information, which requires and refines some senses, but dulls others. It is also likely that of the two modalities I mentioned before, of aestheticization, in situ and in visu, the direct writing of the aesthetic code onto the physicality of the space, or the education into perceiving in a particular way, the latter will assume more importance. If it is not possible to structure the setting so that it furnishes the sensory stimuli desired, the only alternative is to educate people to select stimuli by filtering them through the corporate aesthetic code. And I'm eager to look at more empirical data which might shed clearer light on these new sensory maps and on the emotional climate that supports or is generated by them. So I am not trying to give answers, but to raise questions, and I'm very much interested in listening to comments or spontaneous associations that we can give, listening to these reflections on the nature of the landscape. Thank you.
I've been interested in, thank you very much for that contribution. I've been interested in seeing over the last 50 years how writers particularly have moved away from seeing landscape as a visual aesthetic, which is always a very strong art historical tradition, to the idea of the walker. Everybody writing books about the natural world or landscape in Britain in the last 20 years has done it through some kind of walking journey, either a pilgrimage or some other way of experiencing it. I would trace that partly back to the situationists in Paris, who saw that you have to really kind of walk the terrain before you begin to understand it. So I would be interested, what kind of literature are we going to get out of the corporate landscapes, if we are?
Thank you very much for that. I was very struck by the theme that you mentioned of the aestheticization sometimes being connected with a kind of sacralization, so that many of these corporate landscapes had a trace of the sacred in the kind of architectural style that they were going for, that there was something like the temple or the cathedral or the monastery. And I wonder if you think of that as a debasement of the sacred or a way of preserving it in the modern era.
I'm not sure I understood what your point. Could you please repeat?
I was taken with the way in which you talked about the aestheticizing as sometimes having a kind of sacralizing dimension, a rendering sacred, in the way that some of the architectural landscapes verged in a religious direction toward the temple, toward the factory as the cathedral, the ministry as the monastery. And I wonder if you see this as a debasement of the sacred, a kind of a bad thing, as it were, or you see it as a way of preserving it in the modern period.
No, it's very interesting, because this reminds me of the relationship between architects and managers in companies. When architects have to contribute to create a landscape for the companies, they normally, in my experience, put themselves in a sort of a mediatory roles between social values and specific organizational identities. But it's very clear that every physical landscape impede or facilitate something, hides or shows sequences or articulation, creates this scenographic element. Is very, very important, because I always remember this case when I visited a company where the top manager was always telling me, people here are not looking outside the windows. They don't look outside, don't look outside. And after having told me so many times this sentence, I realized for the first time that there were no windows outside. There were only windows inside. It was a sort of a tower, and all the windows were looking against other windows of the same offices. And in the middle of this tower, there was a statue of the founder, of course. So when you said look outside, outside was exactly look inside. And it was a sort of a fortress. And it was, and they were, look at the consequences of this cultural code inscribed in the architecture. They didn't trust the other people. They felt as they are on a continuous siege. And they used to produce themselves as the nails or the screws. They were producing, I don't know, air conditioning things. But they were using to produce themselves all the elements because they didn't trust the others at all. So, in this case, when you are saying, look outside, and you know that the setting is permitting something but impeding something else. Or is it suggesting in very, very clear way something? I don't know if this is a bit clear.
It's not a question, it's more sort of an observation, and I was really struck by thinking about the nature writing that we were just talking about, pilgrimage and walking. And it feels to me as though there are two things going on. One is this massive explosion in nature writing in the UK, for sure, which is to do with walking and swimming and exploration of the landscape. But simultaneously, the corporation seems to be shutting off the windows, literally, as you've just said, putting on the air conditioning and making us work inwards into our inner landscape. And I feel like they've crept into our emotional landscape. and that the emotional intelligence that is required of a corporate person, or any kind of person actually on a call centre, that you're using a different form of intelligence, and looking at the natural world isn't actually going to help, because what you're actually doing is looking after your corporation. And I know that it's exhausting at the end of the day for people to have actually used that intelligence the whole time. And it just feels like the screen, as you said, sort of separates us from the natural world and is forcing us back inwards into our inner landscapes. So I just find all of that very interesting, connecting that up. No question, really.
I would just like to add to that it's interesting that in the environmental movement, which is supposed to love and appreciate nature, there's a whole new architecture, as you probably know, started in the United States called the LEED certification for very green buildings. So I built one of those on Lac Léman, Lake Geneva, as you might call it. And I realized that the LEED buildings, the LEED platinum buildings, you're not allowed to open the window in order to keep the temperature as green as possible, with which, of course, I agreed, but I felt that it was such a disaster. As a matter of fact, my building was in the middle of nature, and we should have been able to go outside. And so that's a real architectural challenge for anybody who's an architect here.
Sorry, just to come back on that. Mexico City, the architecture, because of course the ambient temperature is extraordinary. And I went to an office building, which was the opposite to what I was talking about corporate owning your inner landscape, where the tree grew up, a massive tree grew up through the centre, and all of the offices were onto that tree, and it was absolutely open to the elements. And when it rained, the rain fell past your desk, which was amazing. And there's an amazing exhibit at the Biennale in the Georgian Pavilion to do with rain falling inside a house, so I'd recommend that as well.
Well, in my experience, I realized that good managers have this sensitivity. The intuition that the physical setting is extremely important. We imagine, create an organization means design an organizational structure, roles, social roles, and relations. No. First of all, you have to think of a physical thing, a physical setting where you are putting a social, which can contain the kind of social setting that you want to realize. We always say here in the foundation that we are very happy because we are in touch with the beauty every day. That's very important. They realize that this has created a sort of standard used spontaneously by everybody, whatever the level in the organization. When they do something, they do at the best. That's not because there are particular rules. This is a value created by the physical setting. We have the privilege to stay in touch with the beauty. We are responsible for the beauty of what we do towards the other. So I think that we should look much more to this relationship between strategies which can be conceptually defined and actions which go through emotions and the physicality, movements, creation of scenographies, and all these other, the education of the smell, the education of the touch. I remember have you seen the new library here? No? When the architect Michele De Lucchi was doing it, he was extremely interested in the sensory experiences. He was asking me, what do you see? Tell me very clearly, what do you smell? I am smelling, the wood is smelling. What do you touch? And he was confronting me with this number of samples of wood, and he pretended me to choose. But this is very, very important, because at the end, the overall sensation that you have when you are inside is determined by all this way your senses have been differently stimulated. This is very, very, very important thing. And when I made a sort of inquiry after when we completed the library, I was asking the people, how do you feel? I feel very well. Why? I don't know why. But once one person told me, I feel I can realize the best of myself here. This was the most rewarding comment I received.
Thank you very much. Some of these comments have made me wonder as well what the corporate world will do with virtual landscapes. And as we are pushed further and further inwards and blocked, if you will, by the screen, if we'll go so far inwards that then corporate world will take over virtual reality, and we'll go back to meeting, but in a virtual world. So now, people work at home instead of working at the office because they work on their computers. And will that then become meeting, you'll do virtual conferences with an avatar, or I'd never thought about it because so far, so much of our virtual reality is about escaping from life or from work, and the idea that might be appropriated by the corporate landscape as well is a little, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but...
Oops, sorry about that. Gravitational field. Thank you very much for your talk. You can almost sort of summarize the history of our interaction with space as space becomes place, and then place becomes decimal place. And I think this is part of the anxiety that essentially about corporate space. But I was wondering whether you would want to pick up on the first comment, which is about how people are now tending to walk space rather than look at it. It's often said by philosophers that vision is the most epistemic of the senses. It's the sense where you are, if you like, most liberated from what is around you. You are relatively free, whereas when you walk through space, you have to engage with it to some extent on its terms. So it's a bit more democratic interaction with the landscape when you're walking, particularly if it's uphill. I speak as an idle sod, basically, and I find it sort of hard going uphill and so on. So I wondered whether this notion of walking space, which correctly does have a lot of origin from the flaneur, the urban flaneur, right through situationists, and more recently the nature writing in England, which has been which has been discussed. But as it were, engagement with landscape as a walker is a much more democratic engagement, much more remote from virtual landscapes. That really wasn't a question, but I'd love to know your response to what I've said. I see.